focus destroys perfectionism and imposter syndrome. Let me explain why, how, and let me take you through it step by step. Every time you engage in a creative project, you unconsciously set up certain psychological defenses that prevent full expression of your potential, full expression of who you are and who you could be. When I say creative project, I mean anything from writing, drawing, or painting to making an effort to create a behavior change or a change in habits. Because remember, your life itself is a creative project. And when I say psychological defenses, I mean thought patterns and behavior patterns that are preventing full expression of your potential in a given situation. Two of the most common and most familiar ones, at least in this context, are imposter syndrome and perfectionism. But now the question is, why would you set up these defenses? Because of fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of sticking out from the crowd. Because if you protect yourself in this way, then it's never fully you who has failed. It is never fully you who is being judged. It is never fully you who is being seen. So there is always this layer of protection, unhealthy protection, but still protection, that gives you a sense of relief, that it will not be fully you, authentically you, who will either be, again, judged, seen, maybe sticking out too much from the crowd. You're all familiar with the tall poppy syndrome, and it will not be fully you who is failing. But still, if you're watching this, you're recognizing that these defenses are not helpful solutions or healthy solutions long term. So then, how do we remove these defenses? Well, there is a state where we naturally and almost effortlessly remove or give up these defenses such as perfectionism and imposter syndrome. And that's a state when we don't need them. Well, when is it that we don't need perfectionism and imposter syndrome? It's when we forget about others and even forget about ourselves. Now, this might sound weird. To forget others, maybe that sounds okay, but to forget yourself, that sounds weird. Well, it's a state of narrowing of consciousness and full immersion, where your capacity to think of others or your capacity to think of yourself critically disappears. What do we mean by this? This is, once again, let's say, loss of self-consciousness. So it's not loss of consciousness and it's not loss of self. It's loss of self-consciousness, which has been discussed by some of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century. The state of full immersion, let's give an example of that. Think of reading a captivating book and being fully immersed, almost as if you are living that story with the characters. Think of listening to a song or a piece of music that feels like you are transported to another world. Maybe you have experienced this while dancing and everything around you disappears. The only thing that exists is this move and this move and this move that you're making. Every second is the only thing that exists. Maybe you've experienced this while playing a sport, maybe while coding or being engaged in some sort of business project. But we are talking about very specific activity where you are always fully immersed and absorbed in the thing that you are doing right now in this moment. Well, two men who talked about this are Abraham Maslow and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Abraham Maslow described this state as one of the main components or aspects of the peak experience, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described this as one of the main components or aspects of the flow state. Peak experience and the flow state are similar but not the same. One of the differences is that peak experience can be experienced, for a lack of better word, in a passive state, while the flow state requires certain goals, and you're probably familiar with the most popular component of the flow state, and that is the balance between skill and challenge. Now, I will not go into deep dive and an analysis of peak experience and flow state because that deserves a video of its own, but it's not enough to say that these are some of the highest human states identified by psychologists. And in both of these states, we have a description of this loss of self-consciousness and narrowing of consciousness that leads to us forgetting ourselves, forgetting others, and because of doing so, because of being in that state, being free from these unnecessary defenses such as perfectionism and imposter syndrome, and that further allows for full authenticity, full expression, and then further we are strengthened by this experience. And even when we get out of it, because we cannot permanently be in flow state, we cannot permanently be in peak experience, it's called peak for a reason, but when we get out of these experiences, we come out of them, again, both Maslow and Csikszentmihalyi talk about this, we come out of them with a strengthened sense of who we are authentically. So let's look at some of the things that they are saying about this. Okay, let's go first, Maslow. He says, narrowing of consciousness. Very important here is our lessened awareness of other people, of their ties to us and ours to them, of obligations, duties, fears, hopes, etc. We become much more free of other people, which in turn means that we become much more ourselves, our real selves, our authentic selves, our real identity. This is so because the greatest cause of alienation from our real selves is our neurotic involvements with other people. The historical hangovers from childhood. That's a funny way to put it. And we can switch to loss of ego, or self-forgetfulness, or loss of self-consciousness. He says, when this happens, when you are totally absorbed in an activity, you tend to become less conscious of yourself. You are less apt to be observing yourself like a spectator or a critic. And this is it. What are you doing when you are overwhelmed with an imposter syndrome or with perfectionism? You are observing yourself like a critic. You are not in contact with yourself and expressing yourself. You are observing yourself like a critic and a judge. Further, he says, this also means less criticizing and editing, less evaluating, less selecting and rejecting, less judging and weighing, less splitting and analyzing of the experience. This kind of self-forgetfulness is one of the paths to finding one's true identity, one's real self, one's authentic nature, one's deepest nature. So once again, Maslow lists narrowing of consciousness and loss of ego. He describes them separately, one after the other, as some of the main components of the peak experience. Now, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in flow. Let's open it. Okay. The loss of self-consciousness. Same like Maslow. He says, preoccupation with the self consumes psychic energy because in everyday life we often feel threatened. Here is the fear. Whenever we are threatened, we need to bring the image we have of ourselves back into awareness. And you think, I don't feel threatened. Well, you don't feel threatened by a tiger, but you feel psychologically threatened by other people. He says, for instance, if walking down the street, I notice some people turning back and looking at me with grins on their faces. The normal thing to do is to immediately start worrying. Is there something wrong? Do I look funny? Is it the way I walk? Or is my face smugged? Hundreds of times every day, we are reminded of the vulnerability of ourselves. So maybe you don't see people looking at you funny on the street, but hundreds of times every day we are reminded of the vulnerability when we want to speak up and say something, when we want to approach someone, when we want to express ourselves and our ideas. And every time this happens, when we are reminded of our psychological vulnerability and the vulnerability of the self, psychic energy is lost in trying to restore order to consciousness. And once again, this is why we have these defense mechanisms, these psychological defenses such as perfectionism and imposter syndrome. Let me protect myself, and let me never fully express myself so that I'm not vulnerable, so that I'm not open for judgment and attacks from other people. But in flow, there is no room for self-scrutiny. Because enjoyable activities have clear goals, stable rules, and challenges well matched to skills, there is little opportunity for the self to be threatened. Because the structure, now I'm not quoting, I'm saying this to kind of simplify it. The structure of the flow-inducing activity is such that it imposes order on your consciousness and requires such capacity, such mental capacity, that there is no room left for self-judgment or fear from other people. Now I'm continuing the quote. When a climber is making a difficult ascent, he's totally taken up in the mountaineering role. He's 100% a climber, or he will not survive. There is no way for anything or anybody to bring into question any other aspect of his self. Once again, think of your experiences where you were fully immersed. Let's now not think too much if it was peak experience or it was flow state. Just think of an experience where you were fully immersed in something. There was no energy or space left in your mind to be judging yourself or to be afraid. But this now raises a question. What's a practical implication of this? The practical implication, and why I started by saying focus destroys perfectionism and imposter syndrome, focus destroys fear, is because you need to have the capacity to be fully immersed. Because the first thing that both Maslow and Csikszentmihalyi mention as necessary components of reaching the peak experience, of reaching the flow state, is the capacity to focus on one thing and one thing only. The capacity to remain focused on one thing and one thing only. The capacity to deeply focus, not to just passively observe something. What does that tell us? It tells us that what they talked about is more relevant in our age than it was even when they were talking about it. And that's focus. Reclaiming control over your attention, practicing focus as a skill and muscle, because it is a skill, it is a muscle that if you don't use, you lose. And developing the capacity to focus deeply and maintain your focus and be strong enough to resist distractions is a prerequisite for reaching this state of deep immersion, entering the flow state, or reaching the peak experience, which then, as we said, is not something that you can maintain permanently. But every time you get out of the flow state, every time you get out of the peak experience, your sense of authentic self is strengthened. And what does that mean? It means that you are less and less in need of protecting yourself, less and less in need and less likely to set up these psychological defenses such as imposter syndrome and perfectionism. So it's not only that the flow state or peak experience protects you from these unhealthy psychological defenses in the moment of you being in this state or experience, is that afterwards it leaves you again stronger, more authentic, more confident in who you are, so that down the line you are less and less likely. We are never counting on zero. And again, we don't want to solve perfectionism with perfectionism. We are never counting on the fact that we will be completely free of perfectionism and imposter syndrome. But the more often you experience full immersion through flow state or peak experience, the less likely you are to need imposter syndrome and perfectionism as unhealthy defenses in the future. What do we conclude with? You need to practice and train your attention and focus. So my question for you is, what is the first lowest barrier thing that you can do to protect your attention and strengthen the skill or muscle of focus in this overwhelming digital age. I can propose you one idea, and that is to start your morning with at least 15 minutes of not looking at any screens and spending time with yourself. There are many other more nuanced or more challenging training activities for attention that I can and will propose in the future. But for now, my challenge for you is that can you start your morning screen-free, technology-free, spend time with yourself, reclaim the control over your attention. That's it, friends. Let me know in the comments how does this sound, if you're ready to take on the challenge of reclaiming your attention, strengthening your focus, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.